When conducting a hypothesis test, we are trying to say something about a larger population based off of a sample of data. And so there's always a chance that what we end up with is the incorrect conclusion, not because we did anything wrong, but just through the nature of data and where the values could fall. Sometimes we don't get the right conclusion, just like we saw with confidence intervals. Sometimes a confidence interval does not contain the population value. So in testing, there are two types of errors that can occur, which are called type 1 and type 2 errors. And this table here lays out where they occur. If the null is really true and the outcome of the test is that you do not reject the null, that's great. You did not have an error there. If the null is actually true, but the outcome of your test is, say, reject the null and get rid of the null, that's called a type 1 error. So type 1 error occurs when we reject the null, but it was actually true. If the null is actually false and we do not reject the null, that is called a type 2 error. So type 2 error is when we do not reject the null, but it was false. If the null is actually false and we reject the null, that's great. That is not an error. So we can look at this example and see what type of error could have occurred. And it just hinges on would you have rejected or not rejected the null. So if we're testing to see if the mean resting metabolic rate's higher after treatment and we have a small p-value, so we reject the null, we are looking at this scenario here. We've rejected the null. Maybe the null is false and then we have no error. So yay, that would be good. But it's possible that this has occurred and we made a type 1 error. So that is why the answer here is type 1 error. For the same reason, B is type 1 error. We are having a small p-value and rejecting the null. So we're in the same column here where we could have had a type 1 error. The other one then, where we have this case here where we have a large p-value and we do not reject the null, means that we're somewhere in here. Possibly the null is true and we have no error, so that would be good. But the other situation is that we've actually made a type 2 error. So that would be the answer here of type 2 error. We never know if we've made a type 1 or type 2 error. Just like we said, we don't know if a confidence interval contains the population value or not. What we can talk about, though, in this section is the chance of these things happening, and that we hope the chance of a type 1 or type 2 error is actually relatively small.